Hi there. Um, I'm in the Sonoran Desert, which you can see behind me here. Actually, I'm not in the Sonoran Desert right now. I'm standing in my house in South Carolina. But about a week ago to a week to 2 weeks ago, I was in this habitat right here, very much like this, walking around. And it's a good way to introduce the concept of biogeography. Now, if you look at this landscape, you look here, you can see these plants behind me. We have really giant tall cacti. This is the famous saguaro cactus. There's some other cacti here and here. These are called cholla cacti. You don't want to bump into those, by the way, because they have very sharp spines that can embed in your skin. And then there's a bunch of flowers blooming along here. This is probably in the spring after or summer after some rain. The point that I'd like to make with this picture is that it is very different looking from the habitat and the plants that you see around you here in South Carolina. And so the question is, why are they different? And you may have some answers in your own head about this. You may know, for example, that because this is a desert, it's a lot drier than it is here in South Carolina. But there are other dry areas in the world that are equally dry that have different plants from these cacti that we see here. For example, if you went to desert regions in Africa, you would see totally different kinds of plants there, but also adapted to dry conditions, like these cacti are here in North America. And so this is a good introduction to the topic of biogeography, which is a study of the distribution of life, of plants and animals, and it asks the question, why do we see plants and animals distributed in the places that they are today on planet Earth? And so I wanted to give you just a very basic background and introduction to the science of biogeography to kind of prepare you a little bit and tell you where we're headed with this class. And so I have some slides that I'm going to show you here. If I can get my screen to work. And I should be up here as a little icon. So you should be able to see my screen, I hope now. I'm going to go full screen. This is a PowerPoint presentation. I'm going to hide myself so that you're not distracted by me. And I'm going to put these slides in a PDF format and also email them to you or put them on the website where we'll load some documents for you to have for the class. So this is just a very basic introduction, as I mentioned, to biogeography. Why does life live where it does today? And on the screen here, you'll see what looks like a fairly crude block map of, you can probably tell what that's supposed to illustrate, the planet and the distribution of the continents and various islands on the planet today. It's fairly crude, but you can see that that's a map, a world map, with oceans in between the continents. All right, if I can make the slides advance. Here is a map. I wonder if any of you have ever seen this map or if you've ever seen any maps like it. If you look at this, you can probably guess or you can probably tell that this is an old map. It looks fairly crude, but there should be some things that are recognizable to you on here. For example, if I have a pointer here, let me see if I can get a little pointer here that I can use. I'm going to choose a yellow pointer, which I think will show up. Let's see. Whoops. No, that's the wrong tool. I don't want that. I want to have a pointer. Well, let me just see if I can use my cursor. If you can see that, I'll try to move it slowly. Maybe you can see where my pointer is. You'll see this is the coast of Europe around here. If you're familiar with geography, there's Spain, here's France, there's Italy. This should obviously be to you the Mediterranean Ocean, and here's the coast of Africa. But once you get over here on the left side of the map, this may look recognizable, but it's a fairly crude looking map. And if you go over to the right side, you can see what appears to be something like maybe India, and then it's not too clear what all this landmass is over here. And in fact, this is an ancient map, and it's a very famous map now. It's known as the Cantino Planisphere. And I have to get out of my pointer now and use my slides again. Oops, let me go back. This is the so-called Cantino Planisphere. This is a Portuguese map constructed in the year 1502. It's one of the oldest maps we have of the global distribution of continents. And this map was made by Portuguese sailors who in those days were beginning to sail around the world, and it was primarily for commercial reasons. They were looking for trade routes for spices and other things. And it's pretty clear that what they mapped here was a primitive map of the coast of North America. That looks like it would be Florida, where my cursor is on the left here, moving around. These are probably islands of the Caribbean. And down here looks like it could possibly be the coast of South America, down to the southern tip of South America. And that's what we think this map indicates, that these sailors went around here to map the coastlines. And this launched through the rest of this century, the 16th, and well as the 17th, and well into the 18th centuries, the so-called Age of Discovery. And I put a question mark here because who is it that was doing the discovering? Well, it was Europeans. They were traveling around the world and they were discovering new continents and new lands that they had not seen before. And I want to just take a moment to point out that, of course, they were not the first people to discover these areas. When Europeans landed in the Americas, there were already people there that had been there long before they got on their sailing ships and traveled over. That already knew a lot about these lands and the plants and animals that were in them. But this age of discovery launched within European culture and European science, a study of plants and animals around the world. So I want to draw your attention back down here to South America. You can see this little area here with some looks like trees on it. And the next slide that I have is going to blow that up and expand it. Here are some red, yellow, and blue birds from the year that they painted in the year 1502. And those are almost certainly scarlet macaws, which is a large parrot, member of the parrot family that you may know about. And over here we see what looks like wet soil and tall, very tall trees, probably a depiction of some of the rainforests that these early explorers found in South America, in Brazil. And so the point here is that once Europeans started traveling around the world, they found totally different kinds of plants and animals than they had experienced seeing in Europe. And so they began to question, why is that? The standard view up until this time and all through much of this so-called age of discovery was the dominant religious view that all life had been created at the same time in a single creation event and that it had not changed and it was the same everywhere. Well, people began to question that narrative because if that was true, why then do you find all of these different kinds of plants and animals in different places around the world? So this led people to begin questioning and scientists to begin questioning the fixed nature of life on Earth and start to explore notions of evolution and change. Here's one of the primary characters that we're going to study in this course, and you're going to hear a lot more from Dr. Costa in Highlands and at Weill Simoco about Alexander von Humboldt. You can see that Humboldt lived from approximately the mid 18th to the mid 19th century, and he was a scientist. He was actually today we would refer to as a polymath who knew a lot about many, many different subjects. And he was Prussian. Prussia is what today includes large parts of Germany. And Humboldt was a prolific traveler and writer, and he studied the distribution of plants and animals around the world. And he actually started the field of biogeography, of describing and trying to explain why you have different kinds of plants and animals in different places. He did go to South America much later than the Cantino's planisphere was constructed, right around the turn of the 19th century. He was there for several years, and he traveled throughout South America, including two places in Ecuador that have become famous and that we will talk about while we are in Ecuador. Dr. Costa likes to describe this class as traveling in the footsteps of the early explorer naturalists, and we're going to see some places that Humboldt himself visited when he was in Ecuador. There are some other people that were a bit younger than Humboldt who read his works and were heavily influenced by Humboldt and his ideas about plants and animals. One of them is our friend Charles Darwin, who I'm sure you all know wrote his magnificent work on the origin of species, describing the mechanism of how species changed. And that mechanism, of course, was natural selection. So Darwin was a little bit younger than Humboldt. He read Humboldt, and Darwin himself did this famous voyage around the world on the HMS Beagle. He was the ship's naturalist, and so his job was to land on these various coastlines, take copious notes, collect specimens of plants, animals, and fossils, and ship them back to England, to the museums of England. And so this was a 5-year voyage. Darwin was violently seasick for much of the time, but he collected lots of information that he then worked on for decades after he got home before publishing his magnificent work on the origin of species. So Charles Darwin we'll hear a little bit about in our course too, as well as this gentleman, Alfred Russel Wallace, who was a contemporary of Darwin and who came up with the idea of natural selection almost simultaneously. You may not have heard Wallace given credit for natural selection. Darwin gets most of the credit, and you'll learn some about this from Dr. Costa as well. But basically, Darwin had been working on that idea for a lot longer, and he'd accumulated a lot more supporting evidence for it. And those are some of the reasons that he gets the primary credit, but we shouldn't forget about Wallace. Wallace had a lot to contribute to biogeography, though, too. He was the first person to divide up the Earth into what he called major biogeographic realms, and I'm going to show you a map of those a little bit later in this presentation. So, just a brief history of tropical ecology and biogeography. As we've seen, it goes back to the 18th and 19th century explorers some of whom we will retrace some of their footsteps in South America. And these were European naturalists that came out of the so-called age of exploration and the expansion of scientific knowledge, like Darwin and Wallace, that collected animal and plant specimens from around the world. And Humboldt, although he was younger, inspired people like Darwin and Wallace. Humboldt was the sort of the founder of biogeography, this study that we're talking about. Humboldt was also the first person to describe what we now call life zones, and this has to do with the distribution of plants and animals in mountainous regions. So at different elevations above sea level, and we're going to experience this directly, both in North Carolina and in Ecuador. As you go up in elevation, higher and higher elevations in mountains, you come across different bands of plant and animal communities at different elevations. And we'll talk about some of the reasons for that and try to unpack those rules that Humboldt described in turn and called them life zones in mountainous areas of the world. So here's our question, our field of biogeography, and there really are three related areas that overlap here. Geography in the center is just the distribution of anything that can be mapped with coordinates. And in particular, we're talking about biogeography, which means the distribution, if you wanted to make maps of plants, animals, and communities. And there are a couple of related fields that affect where plants and animals are found, the fields of ecology and evolution. And we're going to look at some of these factors in this brief lecture, like the effects of climate and also the effects of evolutionary processes. Speciation refers to the origin of new species, and then extinction when lineages end and are never to be seen on Earth again. And we're going to think about the concept of deep time and what effects that has had on the distribution of plants and animals on Earth and life on Earth. And there's two core questions that we ask in biogeography. The first is what we call descriptive. Where are plants and animals located on the earth? What is their geographic range? You can think about it in terms of species, or we won't worry about what the word clade means right now. If you know that, that's fine. Communities are groups of different species that live together. The where question here is the descriptive portion of telling and describing where these plants and animals are distributed. Then the second level of biogeography is analytical. We want to ask, why are these plants and animals found where they are today? What are the processes that explain why we see scarlet macaws in Brazil today, but we do not see them in Europe or in South Carolina? What are the explanations from history and ecology that explain these differences? So here's these famous people that I've mentioned and a couple of others I didn't mention. This is sort of a timeline of the history of biogeography. These are all great naturalists, natural scientists who throughout many, many decades and decades have worked on what our understanding of biogeography has become today. It first started with a gentleman named Linnaeus, who was the first person to try to systematize and name in a scientific manner all life on Earth, classifying life. Then here in the 1800s is our friend Humboldt, who started the field of biogeography, and he talked about these life zones in mountains that we were discussing earlier. Here's Darwin and Wallace's contributions. The evolutionary process explains a lot about why we see plants and animals in different places today. Wallace was the first to name global zoogeographic realms or biogeographic realms, which I'll put a map of up in a moment. And then more recently, I'm not going to have time to talk about this. We may mention it a little bit in the class, this concept of island biogeography, which is much more recent. All right, so here's the two branches that I want to give you basic background on today. One is historical, and you need to think long periods of time, big time periods, deep history. And we're talking about millions and hundreds of millions of years. All right, and our brains don't think on those timescales very readily. We usually think in terms of minutes, days at most, and if we really strain ourselves, we might be able to think about weeks, months, and maybe years. But a million years, a billion years, where our clocks, our brain clocks aren't calibrated to think about those time periods. But fortunately, we have some information about what's happened over the 4.6 billion years of life on Earth now. And these deep time historical factors explain a lot about the differences of the distributions of organisms we see today. So we're going to talk about plate tectonics briefly and continental drift. I'm going to tell you about two processes briefly here called vicariance and dispersal, and then how these groups of related lineages, which we call clades, originate and spread. And then the second aspect we'll explore today is not deep time, but it's more immediate. Like, what is the current climate like today? How does current climate affect plants and animals? And how does it affect the habitats that we see? All right, so we'll get into the historical aspects briefly of biogeography and a little bit of the ecological aspects of biogeography. So historical, probably the biggest single truth or main point that I could give you about historical biogeography is that the continents are moving. And you all know this from previous science classes, I'm sure, that you've had starting even before you came to Francis Marion. The continents are not fixed in place. They are moving around, and I'll briefly tell you about that process in the next slide or two. And in that process, over deep time, over millions of years, life gets dragged along, if you want to think of it that way, on these continents. All right, so the movement of continents and their collisions and their breaking apart has had a major effect on the distribution of life on Earth. This is kind of a crude diagram as well, but it illustrates that the core of the Earth is molten material. It says hot ductile, which basically means moving material. The mantle, the asthenosphere, the molten core of the Earth, is very hot. And anytime you have a hot fluid, hot air, hot liquid, that hot fluid tends to rise up. And it does from the core of the Earth toward the surface. And then it sets up, as we'll see, convection cells that move the continents either toward each other or apart from each other, depending on the direction of these convection cells. So the continents that we are aware of on the planet today are sitting on what are called crustal plates. They're relatively thin plates on the surface of the Earth, and that molten material underneath is like giant conveyor belts that are moving these continents along. The process is very slow. It's about the same rate as your fingernails grow, but over millions and billions of years, that has crashed continents together. It has broken them apart. In some places, one crustal plate is being pushed down underneath the edge of another crustal plate, which makes that area very volcanic and prone to earthquakes. When those plates are at a subduction zone, it's called, when one continental plate or crustal plate is being shoved under another, the friction of all that rock eventually gives, and that results in earthquakes, and it creates hot spots where this molten material will shoot up through these crustal plates and volcanic activity on the surface of the Earth. So this is the main mechanism that has moved continents around over deep time. Here's another very, very crude map that shows an important aspect of the distribution of the Earth's continents over the last 300 million years. So when you see this MYA or BYA abbreviation, that's a shorthand way of writing million years ago or billion years ago. And over on the far right here is the rough distribution of today's continental land masses. You can see that about 300 million years ago, all these land masses were crunched together in a single giant supercontinent, it's called. It's what we call this giant continent of all the current ones crunched together, named Pangaea. Then by about 170 million years ago, Pangaea split apart into a great northern landmass called Laurasia and a southern landmass called Gondwana. And then those continents continued to break and split by about 90 million years ago and move around until they reach their current positions that we see on the right here today. So plants and animals have been carried along and split apart and over long periods of time on these moving continents. And that explains a lot about the distribution of things we see today. This is a somewhat better map. The time frame here, the snapshots in time that you're seeing are a little bit different from the previous slide that I showed you. But the principle is what's important here. 300 to about 225 million years ago, a single landmass called Pangaea. By about 200 and certainly by 170 million years ago, Gondwana and Laurasia split apart into those great northern and southern supercontinents. Then you may be familiar with some of these terms, the Triassic, the Jurassic, and Cretaceous. This was the age of the dinosaurs up until 65 million years ago. These continents were continuing to break apart. You can see here, for example, South America and Africa splitting apart and moving apart from each other as these crustal plates are moved farther apart. This landmass that I'm circling with my cursor right here is what will become the subcontinent of India. It broke off. Here is India here. It split, it broke off and moved north across this global ocean and crashed slowly, but it did crash into the continent of Asia. And that collision of those two crustal plates is what drove the origin of the Himalayas, the tallest mountain range on Earth today, when the Indian subcontinent was pulled under the Asian subcontinent, those crustal plates, and that tremendous pressure produces or builds mountains where you have that happen. So we'll talk about other examples of mountain building in our class. The last thing I want you to notice here is in the Jurassic period, here are the remnants of Gondwana. You can see India split off here. This is Antarctica, which is down here would be where we locate the South Pole today. This landmass that you see right here, that's beginning to break apart by about 65 million years ago, is the continent of Australia. So for 65 million years, Australia has been drifting northward out here by itself in the ocean and moving northward toward the equator. And that explains a lot about what we find in Australia, is just one example that I'm going to give you today. So the evolution of major animal groups is tightly correlated with these change distributions of land masses on Earth. The earliest mammals that we have any record of in the fossil record, you and I are mammals. The first mammals arose about 225 million years ago, and that's back when Australia was still connected to the rest of Gondwana, that southern landmass. The placental mammals, which are mammals with a placenta, including humans, arose only about 80 million years ago, and that was after Australia had already split apart. Remember, I showed you that Australia had separated around 65 million years ago? So the first mammals that made it onto Australia were not placental mammals, and then the placental mammals had no way to get there because Australia was out there in the ocean by itself, drifting for 65 million years to its present place. And so today, besides humans and dingoes and other things that humans have transported to Australia, Australia does not have any large native terrestrial placental mammals. Most of the mammals that we are familiar with around the world are placentals. In fact, Australia is the stronghold, as you know, I'm sure, of the marsupials. So the marsupial ancestors arose before the placentals. They got onto the continent of Australia and diversified through evolution into these forms that we are familiar with now today, like kangaroos and wallabies. This is a wombat down here. This is a koala. These are the pouched mammals, the marsupials, which um, made it out here onto their ancestors made it onto what would become Australia. And then after Australia split, they evolved separately on their own and diversified to fill all of the mammal space in Australia. No placental mammals native there. So if you think about the history of life on Earth and evolutionary processes, there are two ways that populations can share a distribution. All right. Here on this is a very crude, pretend this is a landmass. This green block here on the left is some kind of habitat. And the yellow circles here represent the distribution of a species. It doesn't matter what it is. It could be plants, animals, fungi, it could be anything. And they're distributed across this landscape. The process of vicariance means the appearance of a barrier. What kind of barriers am I talking about? Well, it could be a mountain range that rises up through the activity of mountain building and these crustal plate collisions. Now we've got high mountains here separating these two populations or these two groups of the same plant or animal. And then if you have them separated for a long enough period of time, evolution will change one or both of these populations enough so that they become two different separate species. So evolution through vicariance, the separation of populations explains a lot as well about why we find certain plants and animals where we do today. So that's one way. A second way that we can get different species is if the original species crosses some barrier itself, like the ocean. So, lizards could raft on floating vegetation out onto an island, for example. Or birds, if they're flying around, could get caught in heavy winds and blown off course and land on some island, for example, or land on another landmass even where they don't exist. Those are called founders. And if those stay separated across this barrier for a long enough period of time, you can also get two different species where you had one before. So this is getting at the evolutionary process and how things appear and how they can spread around the world. So these are important processes to think about in biogeography. Here's Darwin and Wallace again. These are photographs of both of them when they were both a bit older. This is one of the most famous maps in biogeography. This is so-called Wallace's line, the red line that you see here. So back in the 19th century, when Wallace was over in Southeast Asia, and I'm not sure if you're familiar with all of these countries, Borneo, Sumatra, Malaysia, the Philippines you probably heard of. Here's Australia over here, which most of you are familiar with. Here's the island nation of New Guinea. Wallace spent a lot of time in here traveling around and looking at animals and plants. Excuse me. And what he noticed is right between this island called Bali and this island called Lombok, which are today are very close together, but there's ocean water in between them. And then this line extends on up here between Borneo and Sulawesi. The animals on either side of this line are radically different from each other. Okay. And Wallace's line was the description of those differences. And so the explanation for this is, again, continental movement. So at one time, all of this landmass over here, when the seas were lower, were connected to Asia. So all of the animals over here are of Asian descent, Asian relatives, whereas all of the animals over here on this side are more similar to what you would find in Australia and New Guinea. And these islands have been moved closer together in recent time by continental drift. So Wallace's line is sort of described here as a knife edge between two worlds. It's one of the most famous patterns in biogeography. So if you go west of that Wallace line, and you'll see animals like these, Asian relatives, tigers, elephants, rhinos, orangutans, lesser apes called gibbons, these kinds of birds. If you go east of that line, you find these Australian animals, kangaroos, wallabies, possums. These are all marsupials, different kinds of birds than you find west of the line. And so the point here is, look at that map. Today, these islands are so close to each other that they have very similar climate, right? So the climate is almost identical. So climate is not what explains these differences. It is the deep time aspect that we're talking about, the movement of continents and separate evolutionary histories. They're found at roughly the same latitude, but they have totally different faunas. And it's that historical biogeography that explains the distribution of these animals on either side of Wallace's line. So climate today can tell you a lot about why things are distributed the way they are, but it can't override this history. The history, the deep time is very important. Okay, here are the biogeographic regions of the world. This map will be in the presentation, and this is Wallace's contribution. I think Wallace's original biogeographic realms included seven different realms. I think this one tries to map out eight. It depends on who you ask today how many biogeographic realms there are, but this is a pretty good map, a good depiction of Wallace's biogeographic realms. What we're going to do in our class is we're going to start up here in Appalachia in North Carolina. And just as we are now in South Carolina, we're in the Nearctic biogeographic realm. You can see the division here, the Nearctic. Over here in Europe and Asia. This is the Palearctic biogeographic realm. When we're finished in North Carolina, we're going to fly down here to Ecuador to the Neotropical biogeographic realm. We're going to compare and contrast these two biodiversity hotspots. One is up here in the temperate zone. The other is down here right next to the equator. So it's fully in the tropics, the tropical life zone. All right. And so these are can be thought of as the sort of the continents of life. These are big regions that have a shared evolutionary history. So the plants and animals within each realm are more similar to each other than they are to the plants and animals in a different realm, any of the different realms. So this is the one of the largest scale types of biogeographical maps you can consider, biogeographical realms. Okay, that's the historical part, the deep time aspect. The other thing that we want to think about is the effects of today's climate and resources. We want to think about the effect of ecology on the distribution of plants and animals today, ecological biogeography. This is the second part of the talk. So we're going to start in North Carolina where we're in the temperate zone, much as we are here. We're going to go to the tropics. The question is, why are the tropics warm and wet? What's the explanation of that? Well, the basic explanation is there is more solar insolation. Notice that spelling. I'm going to talk about that again in a minute. INSO, not INSU. Insolation, which just refers to the sunlight rays, the sun energy per unit area that hits the Earth. There's more solar insolation per unit area at the equator, and I'm going to show you why in a moment. And with that extra solar energy, that heats the air, which rises, and as warm air rises, it cools. As air cools, it dumps out any moisture that it contains, and that comes down as precipitation back onto the land. And this creates a number of large convectional air masses around the planet that are called Hadley cells. I'll show you a graphic of these in just a moment. So the warm air at 0 degrees latitude at the equator rises, cools, and it rains. All that rain and that warm temperatures create what we call the tropical zones of the Earth today. It's about 30 degrees north and south of the equator, roughly. Excuse me, about 20 degrees rough and north, south and north of the equator. Then when you get to about 30 degrees north and south, that cool air sinks back down to the surface of the Earth. And remember, it's dry because it's rained out over the tropics. It's wrung out all of its moisture. And 30 degrees north and south latitude is where you tend to find most of the great desert regions of the world, the dry habitats, like the one I showed you a picture of at the beginning of this talk in Arizona, the Sonoran Desert. So here's a little crude diagram again that shows a half of the Earth, a hemisphere here, with this being the equator. And we've got the North Pole at the top, the South Pole at the bottom. Very center of this would be the equator, and these are latitudes, north and south of the equator, 0 degrees. You know, if you're up here at the poles, it would be 90 degrees. So you go from 0 to 90 degrees latitude, north and south of the equator. So if you're at the equator, 0 degrees, it's hot and wet. That's where we tend to find the rainforests of the world, like we'll experience in Ecuador. When you get to about 30 degrees north and 30 degrees south, the air is cool and it drops back down. That's where you find the great deserts of the world. Then farther away from the equator, at about 60 degrees north and south, it's also wet, but it's a bit cooler. It's mild and wet. This is where we find the temperate forests of the world. And finally, when you get up here to these polar regions, north and south, it's very cold and very dry. The polar regions are actually a cold desert. That's what you find, the habitat that you find near the poles. So here's a little diagram that shows why there's more solar insolation at the equator. The sun's rays are parallel. They strike the Earth directly at the equator, direct vertical rays. And so this circle here represents an area of sunlight rays that are hitting the tropics in parallel. If you take that same amount of sunlight energy and you move it toward the poles, because of the curvature of the Earth, it spreads that area in an oblique way over more of the surface area of the Earth. So there's less solar energy per unit area farther away from the equator. These are oblique rays that are striking the Earth at an angle, not direct rays as you find vertical rays here. So there's less solar energy, less solar insolation per meter square, that should say, per area, per unit area. So that explains why the tropics are warmer and wetter. This air rises and it rains out at the equator. Here's another diagram that shows the same concept. It's even simpler. Um, this is higher solar radiation per unit area, these direct parallel rays at the equator. That is insolation, not insulation with a U. That would refer to material that retains heat or prevents heat loss. So more solar energy per unit area near the equator, less as you spread that same amount of solar energy out around the curvature of the Earth farther north. The tropics fall about 20 degrees, more or less. It's closer to 23 degrees north and south latitude of the equator. The equator is 0 degrees. And that's what, if you look at a map today, is labeled as the Tropic of Cancer, which is north of the equator, and the Tropic of Capricorn, which is south of the equator. Here's one more map of the globe that shows these big convection cells. This is a diagram showing the Hadley cells, the direction of the spinning of air masses relative to the equator and to the poles. So there's one south of the equator and one north of the equator. The equator's getting all the heat. That air rises, it rains and is warm here in the tropics. Then that air sinks back down at about 30 degrees north and south, and that's where you find the drier areas, the deserts of the world. And then up here at about 60 degrees, we find a milder and wetter temperate zone, the north temperate zone and the south temperate zone. And then finally, when you get up to the poles, it's cold and dry. So these circulation patterns you see here are the Hadley cells that I told you about in the previous slide. I named them in a previous slide. And this is exactly the way this would look if the Earth wasn't rotating. But the Earth does rotate. I'll show you what that looks like in a minute. Here's another map of the same thing of the globe. What is the point here? Why am I babbling on? These global air currents and the solar insolation patterns from the equator to the poles determines a lot about the distribution of plants and animals. If it's really dry, you're going to have deserts. If it's really, really wet, you're going to have tropical rainforests or temperate forests. If it's very cold and very dry, you're going to have polar ice caps. All right, so climate and air currents affect ecosystems all around the world. This does show you that these are the Hadley cells that are rotating around here. And in fact, because the Earth is also rotating, it's moving from west to east. It's rotating in the direction of my cursor here, from west to east. That pulls these winds of these air currents to the side. So these are actually the major. They're called trade winds if you're familiar with sailing, and westerlies. These are the predominant wind patterns that you see because of the rotation of the Earth underneath these air cells, these big Hadley cells. Okay, another way that we can divide life on Earth that really shows the effects of ecology and climate is the world's biomes. These are sort of climate bands around the world. Um, and you don't need to memorize this map, but I just want you to look here and see that we're going to start out in this sort of light green area here in North Carolina, which is temperate broadleaf forest. Much of the eastern United States is in that broadleaf forest. Okay, we're going to head down here to this little eastern green area in Ecuador. which is tropical rainforest, right? So biomes are large geographic areas of similar plants and animals that are determined primarily by the climate that we see in that area. So different climate bands, you have different biomes. Um, Different continents can have a similar climate, but and similar biomes. So think about the tropics. Look at my cursor. Here's the equator. All right. Let's go from Ecuador through Brazil and cross the Atlantic Ocean. Now we're in Central Africa and continuing on across Africa until we get over here into Southeast Asia. And you'll notice that all of those regions, the neotropics, the African tropics, the Southeast Asian tropics, are tropical rainforests. They have similar climate. It's warm and wet. It rains a lot. There are huge trees. But the species that are in Ecuador and Central Africa and Sumatra and Borneo are different because of the historical biogeography. They have different ancestors and they rode apart on different continents. So that's a good map to explain why we need both of these aspects of deep time, continental drift, and vicariance and evolution and then couple that with ecological understanding of current climate to really explain why we see plants and animals distributed in their current locations. Okay, this is just a really quick intro for you for a gentleman named Whitaker, and you'll hear a lot more about Whitaker when we get to Highlands as well in North Carolina. He came up with this scheme that you can see roughly outlined in this graph here, showing how the mean annual precipitation on the y-axis, so over here, we're getting more and more annual precipitation. Very dry at 0 would be no precipitation. Very wet, 4,500 millimeters. Super wet, very wet climate. And down here on the x-axis, we have mean annual temperature in degrees C. 0 is where water freezes, very cold. Down here to the left, warmer and warmer as you get up to the right. So each of these colors here corresponds to what we would call a different biome of life on Earth. And Whitaker was the person to point out that if you know the mean annual precipitation and the mean annual temperature, you can more or less predict what kind of ecosystems you're going to see when you go to that area. Will you see temperate forest or temperate rainforest like we might see in North Carolina? Do you see tropical rainforest like you might see in Ecuador or Brazil? Do you see desert, for example? Cooler or hotter desert like I see in Arizona when I go out there. It's much drier, but very warm. All right, so these are these different types of biomes, the major biomes of the planet, and how they are explained by temperature and precipitation. This is a very important topic that we will discuss quite a bit when we're in class in North Carolina and in Ecuador. This is something that you should be familiar with. It's called the latitudinal diversity gradient. Okay, here's the take-home message. More species live near the equator. It almost doesn't matter what group of species you're talking about. It could be birds, it could be reptiles, it could be trees, it could be insects, you name it. And each of those groups, plants, animals, fungi, you're going to find high numbers of species. That's what's called species richness in the tropics. And that number will fall off as you go north of the tropics toward the North Pole. And it also declines as you go south of the tropics toward the South Pole. Why are there more species in the tropics? This is one of the great questions of global biogeography. And we don't have one answer to answer this question. It seems to depend on the group of species. I'm not going to read this list to you here. Bullet points on the right, I'd like for you to read it. These are some of the potential explanations for why there are more species in the tropics than there are in temperate zones and in polar regions. All of these may apply to certain groups. One or more of them separately may apply to other groups. These are hypotheses that have been discussed for why we have more species in the tropics, why we see this latitudinal diversity gradient. And we'll see that directly as we travel from North Carolina to Ecuador, comparing different groups of species. So have a look at that list here and just think about those a bit. We'll dig into it more when we're in the actual class. So each species has what in ecology what we call a niche. A niche is that species' range of requirements that it can thrive in. All right. The niche. Let's just take one aspect of a species niche, the environmental temperature. Pick a species, any species. There's some environmental temperature where that species is going to do the best. It survives better, it reproduces better. This peak in performance or fitness, survivability, number of offspring left is the optimum temperature range for that species. If it gets too cold, oops, sorry, didn't mean to go forward. If it gets too cold or it gets too hot, that species may not be able to hack it, right? Maybe they can't live in those regions. So environmental factors set the constraints of a species and where it lives in terms of its niche requirements. The niche can be temperature, it can be food availability, it can be aspects of the habitat that species needs. And this is an important feature of organisms that also determines where they live. So if you have tropical species, some of them have a very narrow band of very warm temperatures. They might have a curve that's very narrow, that's up here somewhere, a peak like this, where they don't do very well if it gets much cooler than that or very much warmer than that. This species that's drawn here has quite a wide range of tolerance, but you get up here, close to freezing or up about 25 degrees, they're not going to be able to make it. All right, it really does best in this range here. So species niche requirements will also set its range and where you can find it on planet Earth today. So where things live today is a function of history, the deep time aspect, the continental drift, the splitting and crashing together of land masses, the vicariance or dispersal of organisms around the world. These are the deep time legacies, the history, the evolutionary and geological history that explain where things live today. You have to combine that with ecology, current climate, current aspects of the environment where that species lives, what that species can tolerate in terms of its niche breadth. All of these ecological factors also determine what we find where. So when you look at any species range, ask both which lineages even had a chance to be here. This is the historical aspect. And of those, which can actually live in that place today. These would be the ecological aspects, its requirements, what it can tolerate, what it needs, what it can survive in today. Here's Humboldt. Humboldt came up with something called Humboldt's Law. I'm getting near the end of my lecture here. It's almost an hour, dragging on. That describes parallels between altitude and latitude. This is one of Humboldt's seminal contributions. I want to quickly explain it. He noticed that if you're in mountains, and I've expressed this as English units because most of us are still familiar with degrees Fahrenheit and feet instead of meters. But Humboldt's law says that if you go into mountains, if you go up 300 feet in elevation, it's going to get cooler by about 1 degree Fahrenheit. The higher in elevation you go, the cooler it gets. At high elevations, air is less dense, the molecules are not crashing together as frequently, and the air is cooler high in the mountains. So that affects the climate zones of different elevations on the mountains. So as you go up in elevation, it gets cooler. As you move down a mountain, it gets warmer. The same factor happens if you travel at sea level north or south of the equator. All right. The equator is hot, it's warm. As you travel north for about each 67 miles north or south of the equator you travel, the temperature also decreases by about 1 degree Fahrenheit. These are averages. These are averages, average annual temperatures. So these changes are reflected in plant and animal communities that we see at different elevations. And this is the basis for Humboldt's life zones. He was the first to describe life zones. And later I'll tell you about an extension of his work in the tropics that was contributed by a scientist named Leslie Holdridge. All right, this is a mountain in Costa Rica. I used to teach this class in Costa Rica many years ago, and that's where I pulled this slide from. But there's a mountain here where my cursor is in Costa Rica called Cerro de la Muerte, which is just over 10,000 feet in altitude. At the base of that mountain at sea level, you find tropical species. As you go up that mountain from 2,000 to 10,000 feet, you find these bands of species that are quite different from the ones you find at sea level. So if you go to the top of Cerro de la Muerte, you find plants and animals that are much more similar to what you might see up here in the northern United States and southern Canada at about 50 degrees north latitude, north of the equator. So this is the parallel between altitude and latitude. It gets colder as you go north, it gets colder as you go up in altitude, and the plant and animal communities reflect those climate differences as you move up and down mountains or north and south of the equator. So here are five elevational zones in Costa Rica. Ecuador mountains could be described in much the same way. Low elevations, tropical rainforest. You go up in elevations, you're going to get into different types of tropical forests. And finally, when you're on the highest peaks in Ecuador that are over 10, 11,000 feet in height, you're up here in subalpine conditions that may have ice and glaciers that reflects that lowering of temperature. So, biogeography is important. I'm almost finished. This and one more, two more slides. These same principles that I've told you about explain some of the most urgent environmental questions we're dealing with today. I'm not going to read these to you. This isn't important really for you to know for the class. But biogeography is an important field of study because it informs us about the distribution of plants and animals and therefore what we need to do to conserve them, how climate change is going to affect plant and animal populations, how invasive species that we've introduced are going to affect native biodiversity, and even human disease and health and the disease and health of other organisms. All of these are affected by biogeography. So, three things to remember. Biogeography asks two questions. Where are plants and animals distributed today, and why are they located there? So, the where part is the descriptive biogeography. The why part is the analytical part, the deep history, the evolutionary processes, the movement of continents, the vicariance, the dispersal of organisms, those factors. So the historical and the present ecological explain why we find plants and animals where they are today. Historical and ecological lenses. And you can't just look at one, you have to look at both. Climate can't override history, and history doesn't override climate. They're both important, but they work together to determine why we find scarlet macaws in Brazil today and why we find saguaro cacti in southern Arizona and why you find northern cardinals in South Carolina and all the many other plants and animals that we think about. Okay, well, that's it. I'm going to stop the share, and I'm also going to stop the Zoom recording if I can find where that button is. Ah, there it is. So what I'm going to do now is upload this to YouTube, and I'm going to email you. You'll get the email when I have the link. You can go to this and watch it on YouTube. It's just going to be a fabulous lecture. You'll love it. Review it. Hopefully, it'll give you a little bit of a leg up in terms of being prepared for the class. Some of the other students often that take this course, we found in the past may have had significant numbers of upper level ecology or maybe even biogeography classes. So I wanted to make sure that you guys were hitting the ground running a little bit. If you have any questions about this, I want you to let me know. Um, Also, during the course, if there's anything that you have a question about, either from Dr. Costa's lectures or from mine that you're not clear about, you want to ask me, I want to encourage you to do that. So I'm going to stop recording now, and you'll be hearing more from me as well as Dr. Costa very soon. Bye now, and have a great day. See ya.